Snoop Dogg was just trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon stroll through Long Beach, the sun low in the sky and a mellow beat playing in his headphones. But as he rounded the corner by a small convenience store, he noticed something that killed his vibe instantly. Across the street, 3 teenagers had surrounded a man in a wheelchair, their laughter sharp, their voices loud with mockery. They shoved his chair back and forth, treating him like a joke while he flinched, trying to protect himself, trapped with nowhere to go. Snoop slowed his stride, pulling out his earbuds as the easygoing energy he carried shifted into something colder, sharper. He'd witnessed plenty in his time, but this was different. Walking away wasn't an option. But Snoop wasn't about to meet their cruelty with anger, he had a smarter way to put an end to it. And they had no idea what was coming. The warm California sun bathed Long Beach in a golden glow, and Snoop Dogg was feeling it. Dressed in a casual tracksuit, his signature shades resting comfortably on his nose, and his headphones playing smooth beats, it was just another laid-back afternoon. The breeze carried the scent of the ocean mixed with the familiar aroma of street tacos from a nearby food truck. Life felt easy, just the way Snoop liked it. But all that changed when he turned the corner. The moment he saw the scene unfolding across the street, his vibe shifted from chill to sharp. 3 teenagers, no older than 16, were huddled around a man in a wheelchair. Their laughter was loud, mocking, the kind of sound that made your skin crawl. One of them gave the wheelchair a rough push, causing the man to jolt forward, struggling to regain control. His hands trembled as he tried to shield himself, his face tight with fear and frustration. Snoop pulled out his earbuds, the music fading as the harsh reality of the situation took over. He wasn't one to let disrespect slide, especially not like this. The sun dipped lower in the Long Beach sky, casting elongated shadows across the pavement as Snoop Dogg stood still, his gaze locked on the scene across the street. The warm breeze that had been gently rustling the palm trees moments ago felt different now, sharper, like it carried the weight of what was unfolding. The teenagers were laughing, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that filled a room with joy. It was mean-spirited, harsh, the sound cutting through the usual hum of the neighborhood like a blade. They shoved the man's wheelchair again, sending him lurching forward, and Snoop felt a slow, simmering heat rise in his chest. The easy rhythm of his afternoon stroll was gone. The beats in his headphones had faded into the background, replaced by the growing pulse of something else, righteous anger. Snoop pulled out his earbuds, the sudden absence of music making the street sounds feel louder, more immediate. He didn't rush, he never did. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath and started crossing the street. Each step felt heavy but measured, his classic swagger grounded in something deeper than style. The soles of his sneakers met the asphalt with a steady rhythm, echoing the quiet authority that followed him everywhere he went. His tall frame, draped in a simple tracksuit, moved with purpose. The sun caught the edge of his gold chain, reflecting a brief glint of light that seemed to cut through the tension ahead. The kids hadn't noticed him yet. They were too busy with their cruelty, too wrapped up in the false confidence that came from picking on someone who couldn't fight back. But that was about to change. Halfway across the street, Snoop saw it, the moment everything shifted. The tallest of the 3 kids, a lanky teenager with a buzz cut and a forced smirk, glanced up and froze mid-laugh. His eyes widened just slightly, the recognition dawning like a slow sunrise. He elbowed his friend, his voice dropping to a whisper that didn't quite hide the nervous edge. "Yo, is that Snoop Dogg?" The other 2 turned, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty in an instant. For a second, they all just stared, as if trying to process what they were seeing. Snoop Dogg, the Snoop Dogg, was walking toward them, and he didn't look like he was in the mood to chat. But Snoop didn't say a word. He let his presence do the talking. There's a kind of power in silence, a weight that fills the space where noise used to be. The kids felt it immediately. The air seemed to grow thicker, the street sounds dulling as Snoop closed the distance. His shades hid his eyes, but the tension in his jaw, the slight downturn of his mouth, it all spoke volumes. He wasn't here to play. The man in the wheelchair glanced up, his eyes meeting Snoop's for a brief moment. There was fear there, but also something else, a flicker of hope, like maybe, just maybe, things were about to turn around. Snoop stopped just a few feet away, his tall frame casting a shadow that stretched out toward the teenagers. The late afternoon sun highlighted the sharp lines of his face, the cool exterior barely hiding the simmering heat beneath. The kids shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of Snoop's silent stare. The tallest one tried to recover, forcing another laugh that sounded more like a cough. But Snoop wasn't laughing. He took off his shades slowly, letting them hang from the collar of his shirt. His eyes, usually hidden behind those iconic lenses, were sharp and focused now. There was no mistaking the message in that gaze, this stops now. The tension was thick enough to cut, but Snoop finally let his voice slip into the space, smooth and steady like a bass line. "What y'all think you doin'?" It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even loud. But the calm in his voice carried more weight than any yell could. It was the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly who you were, and letting everyone else figure it out the hard way. The tallest kid straightened up, trying to salvage his tough guy act. "We're just messin' around, man. It's not a big deal." But Snoop took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Nah," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It is a big deal." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The kids exchanged glances, their earlier bravado crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Snoop let the silence stretch again, watching them squirm under the weight of their own actions. It wasn't just about scaring them, it was about making them feel the wrongness of what they were doing. "You think it's funny to mess with someone who can't fight back?" Snoop continued, his voice smooth but razor sharp. "That make you feel tough?" The smallest kid, who'd been the quietest from the start, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting between Snoop and the man in the wheelchair. His hands fidgeted nervously in the pockets of his hoodie, the realization of their mistake sinking in fast. The man in the wheelchair watched the scene unfold, his breathing still uneven but slowing as the tension shifted away from him. His hands, which had been clenched tightly around the wheels of his chair, began to relax, the fear in his eyes replaced by cautious relief. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Snoop's presence was speaking for both of them now. The kids were quiet, their eyes fixed on the ground, but Snoop wasn't done yet. Snoop took another slow step forward, his presence filling every inch of space between them. "Real strength," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It ain't about pickin' on people who can't stand up for themselves. It's about liftin' folks up when they're down. You feel me?" The tallest kid's smirk was long gone. He nodded slowly, his tough exterior shattered under the weight of Snoop's words. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was necessary. It gave the kids time to sit with their actions, to feel the shame creeping in where their false confidence used to be. Snoop finally stepped back, giving them space to make a choice. "Now," he said, his voice still calm but firm, "y'all can either do the right thing, or you can keep actin' like fools. But know this, you ain't impressin' nobody out here." The kids stood there for a beat longer, the gravity of the moment settling in. Then, slowly, the tallest one stepped forward, glancing at Snoop before turning to the man in the wheelchair. Sorry, man," he mumbled, his voice low and unsure. The other two followed, their apologies soft and mumbled, their eyes never leaving the ground. Snoop nodded, satisfied. It wasn't about humiliating them, it was about making sure they walked away with a lesson they wouldn't forget. "Aight," Snoop said, his voice softening just a bit. "Now bounce." The kids didn't hesitate. They turned and walked away, their laughter replaced by silence, leaving behind the man they'd tried to tear down and the legend who'd built him back up without lifting a finger. The street had gone quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence Snoop Dogg was used to. It was the heavy, suffocating kind, the kind that made even the faintest sounds feel louder. The distant hum of a car radio, the soft rustle of palm leaves in the afternoon breeze, the screech of bicycle tires from a kid riding down the block, all of it seemed to fade into the background as Snoop stood just a few feet from the teenagers. They were frozen, staring at him, their earlier confidence draining away like water through a cracked cup. Snoop didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it hang in the air, thick and uncomfortable, giving the kids enough time to feel the weight of what they'd done. The man in the wheelchair sat motionless, his hands gripping the wheels tightly, his eyes darting between the teens and Snoop. There was fear in his expression, but also something else now, a flicker of hope, a silent question: is this really happening? Snoop finally spoke, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge that cut through the stillness like a knife. "What y'all think you doing?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The smooth, steady tone hit harder than any shout could. It wasn't just a question, it was a statement. A challenge. The tallest kid, still trying to salvage some sense of control, forced a laugh. But it was shaky, lacking the cockiness it had before. "We're just messing around, man. It's not a big deal," he said, glancing nervously at his friends for support. But there was no support coming. The other two stood silently, their shoulders tense, their bravado evaporating under Snoop's unflinching gaze. Snoop took a step closer, his presence filling the space like a tidal wave. He slowly removed his shades, revealing sharp, piercing eyes that locked onto the kids like a spotlight exposing a secret. "Nah," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It is a big deal." The words echoed in their heads, louder than the ambient noise of the street. There was no misunderstanding his message. He wasn't just calling them out, he was holding up a mirror, forcing them to see exactly what they were doing. Snoop's posture remained relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. They were steady, unwavering, and full of a quiet intensity that spoke louder than words ever could. He didn't need to flex. His reputation alone carried enough weight to make these kids question every bad decision they'd made that day. "You think it's funny to mess with someone who can't fight back?" he asked, his voice smooth but sharp enough to slice through whatever false confidence they had left. "That make you feel tough?" The tallest kid's smirk faded completely, his eyes flickering with something unfamiliar: guilt. The smallest of the three kids shifted uncomfortably, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. He glanced at the man in the wheelchair, then back at Snoop, the reality of their actions sinking in deeper with each passing second. "I mean, we weren't trying to, like, hurt him or anything," the kid mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze hardening. "You think it ain't hurtin' when you treat somebody like that?" he shot back. "Ain't about throwin' punches, it's about respect. And y'all don't got any." The man in the wheelchair, emboldened by Snoop's presence, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but steady. "They think they're tough 'cause they know I can't run," he said, his eyes now fixed on the teenagers. "But I bet they wouldn't act like this if it was someone who could stand up." Snoop gave him a nod of acknowledgement, his eyes never leaving the kids. "You hear that?" Snoop said, his voice still calm. "He ain't scared no more. But y'all? Lookin' pretty shook right now." The tallest kid swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. The false bravado he'd worn like armor had completely cracked, leaving nothing but a scared teenager standing in front of someone who wasn't buying the act. Snoop let the silence linger for a beat longer, then took a step back, giving them space to make a choice. "Real strength?" Snoop said, his voice lowering even more, almost like he was sharing a secret. "It ain't about pickin' on people who can't fight back. It's about liftin' folks up when they're down. That's what makes you a man." The words hit harder than any punch. The kids stood there, their faces pale, their shoulders slumped. The lesson was sinking in, deeper than any punishment could have delivered. Finally, the tallest kid stepped forward, his voice low, his eyes avoiding both Snoop and the man in the wheelchair.
Sorry, man," he muttered.
The other two followed, mumbling their apologies, their heads bowed in shame. Snoop nodded slowly, satisfied but not smug. It wasn't about humiliating them, it was about making sure they understood the weight of their actions. "Aight," Snoop said, his voice soft but firm. "Now bounce." The kids didn't hesitate. They turned and walked away, their earlier laughter replaced by an awkward, heavy silence that trailed behind them like a shadow. They disappeared down the street, their heads low, leaving behind a man who'd just been defended by one of the most recognizable figures in the world, and a lesson they'd carry with them long after the day was over. Snoop watched them go, his expression calm but thoughtful. Sometimes, standing up for someone didn't require fists or fury, just the right words at the right time. And for Snoop Dogg, those words hit harder than any punch ever could. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. The teenagers stood there, frozen under Snoop Dogg's piercing gaze, their earlier bravado slipping away with every second. The street, usually filled with the casual buzz of Long Beach life, felt unusually quiet. The faint sounds of distant conversations, the occasional honk from a passing car, and the rhythmic squeak of a bike chain were all muted by the weight of the moment. Snoop, standing tall in his tracksuit and signature shades now hanging from his collar, radiated a calm that wasn't just about cool, it was about control. His presence alone had shifted the entire dynamic, but he wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about calling the kids out, it was about flipping the entire narrative on them. The tallest kid, who had tried to maintain his tough facade, was starting to crack. His eyes darted between Snoop and the man in the wheelchair, unsure of where to look, unsure of what to say. The cocky grin that had been plastered on his face earlier was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that barely masked his growing discomfort. Snoop saw it. He felt it. But he wasn't going to let them off easy. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, letting each step carry the weight of his words before he even spoke. "You know," Snoop began, his voice smooth but edged with steel, "it's easy to act hard when you think nobody's watching. Easy to push around someone you think can't push back." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The kids shifted uncomfortably, the silence pressing down on them like a physical force. "But let me tell y'all something," Snoop continued, his eyes narrowing just enough to make his point crystal clear. "Real strength? It ain't about making someone else feel small. It's about making sure people know they're worth something. You feel me?" For the first time, the man in the wheelchair spoke. His voice was quiet but steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "He's right," the man said, his eyes fixed on the kids. "You think you're tough, 'cause you picked the easy target. But that ain't strength. That's weakness." The kids looked at him, then back at Snoop, the realization sinking in deeper with each passing second. The smallest of the three glanced at the ground, his hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets, his earlier confidence now nothing more than a fading memory. Snoop took a deep breath, letting the moment settle before delivering the final blow. "You see, life's got a funny way of coming back around," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You treat people like they ain't worth nothing, and one day, you'll find yourself on the other side, wondering why no one's there to lift you up." The words hit home. The kids stood there, their faces pale, their shoulders slumped, as the weight of their actions pressed down on them harder than any punishment ever could. Snoop stepped back slightly, giving the kids space to make a choice. This was the moment, the fork in the road where they could either own up to what they'd done or walk away, carrying the shame of it with them. The tallest kid swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening as he finally stepped forward.
Sorry, man," he muttered, his voice low and unsure, directed at the man in the wheelchair.
The other two followed suit, mumbling their apologies without meeting anyone's eyes. The weight of the moment was too much to ignore, and they knew it. Snoop nodded slowly, his expression softening just enough to let them know the message had landed. "Aight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Now bounce." The kids didn't need to be told twice. They turned and hurried down the street, their earlier laughter replaced by silence. They didn't look back. They didn't have to. The lesson had been learned. Snoop turned his attention back to the man in the wheelchair, who was adjusting his position, still a little shaken but clearly relieved. His eyes met Snoop's, and for a moment, no words were needed. The gratitude was written all over his face. "You good, homie?" Snoop asked, his tone softening, the edge of confrontation melting into genuine care. The man nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension that had gripped him moments before. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Thanks, man. Didn't know what I was gonna do." Snoop gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Ain't no tang," he replied, his signature cool slipping back into place. "We gotta look out for each other out here. That's how it's supposed to be." The man nodded again, his smile growing a little wider, the fear that had clouded his face now replaced by something else, hope. Snoop slipped his shades back on and started walking down the street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows behind him. The vibe had shifted again, but this time, it felt even better than before. He didn't need applause or recognition. The man was safe, and those kids. They'd think twice before pulling something like that again. Sometimes, being the toughest person in the room wasn't about throwing punches. Sometimes, it was about standing tall and speaking truth. And Snoop Dogg? He'd been doing that his whole life. As the kids' apologies hung in the air, the street seemed to pause, the weight of the moment settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. The earlier noise, the distant hum of traffic, the faint chatter from the nearby corner store, the soft breeze rustling through the palm trees, felt like background noise in a scene that had shifted from chaos to clarity. The man in the wheelchair adjusted his position, his hands still trembling slightly as he processed what had just happened. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to say. The fear that had gripped him earlier was fading, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. Snoop Dogg stood there, his presence still commanding, but his eyes had softened. The sharp edge of confrontation had been replaced by something calmer, more grounded. He wasn't just satisfied that the kids had walked away, he was making sure the man knew he wasn't alone. Snoop turned his full attention to the man in the wheelchair, giving him the kind of nod that spoke volumes without a single word. It wasn't just a gesture of respect, it was recognition. Snoop knew that facing down bullies took a different kind of courage, especially when you were vulnerable. "You good, homie?" Snoop asked, his voice lower now, softer but still carrying that steady weight. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Snoop's, and for a second, he just nodded, unable to find the words. Then, as the adrenaline faded, he finally spoke. Yeah, I'm good now," he said, his voice shaky but sincere. "Thanks, man. I didn't know what I was gonna do." Snoop crouched down slightly, getting eye level with the man. His face, usually hidden behind shades and a laid-back grin, was open and sincere. "Ain't no tang," he said quietly. "We gotta look out for each other out here. That's how it should be." The man nodded, his eyes glistening slightly, not from fear anymore but from something deeper, gratitude, relief, and the recognition that sometimes, even in the middle of a city, there were still people who cared. As Snoop helped adjust the man's wheelchair, a few bystanders who had been watching from a distance began to relax. A woman across the street gave Snoop a subtle nod, her eyes reflecting the same respect the man felt. A couple of teenagers, who had seen the whole thing unfold from their bikes, exchanged quiet glances, clearly affected by what they'd witnessed. It wasn't just about the man in the wheelchair or even the bullies, it was about everyone who saw that standing up for someone didn't always have to be loud or violent. Sometimes, it was about being present, being firm, and letting people know they weren't invisible. Snoop stood up, his gaze scanning the street for a moment, soaking in the calm after the storm. He'd dealt with all kinds of situations in his life, from the music industry's chaos to personal struggles, but this? This was about something simpler, something purer. It was about respect. About humanity. And about making sure people knew they mattered. Before Snoop could walk away, the man called out to him, his voice steadier now. "Hey, Snoop," he said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you did." Snoop turned, a smile of his own tugging at his lips. "Sometimes you gotta do something," he replied. "Especially when no one else will." Snoop slipped his shades back on, the familiar coolness returning to his demeanor. But this wasn't about style, it was about closing a chapter, knowing he'd done what needed to be done. As he started walking down the street, his steps light but purposeful, the sun casting long shadows behind him, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. He didn't need applause. He didn't need anyone to know what had just happened. The man was safe, and those kids. They'd carry that lesson with them longer than they realized. As Snoop disappeared down the street, the impact of his actions lingered. The man in the wheelchair watched him go, a newfound confidence settling in his posture. The bystanders who'd witnessed the scene would carry that moment with them, a reminder that standing up for someone didn't always require fists, it required presence. And somewhere down the road, those three kids would remember the day they messed with the wrong man, not because he was famous, but because he showed them what real strength looked like. Snoop Dogg continued his walk, the beat in his headphones picking back up as he slipped his earbuds in. The city buzzed around him, life returning to its usual rhythm, but something was different now. Not in a big, dramatic way, but in the small, quiet way that mattered most. Because sometimes, the biggest changes happen in the smallest moments. For Snoop, it wasn't about making headlines or gaining recognition. It was about doing the right thing when it mattered. And as he walked off into the golden glow of the long beach afternoon, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, being the strongest person in the room isn't about how loud you are or how hard you hit. Sometimes, it's about how you show up. And Snoop Dogg? He'd been showing up his whole life. As Snoop Dogg walked away, the city's usual rhythm slowly returned, but for those who had witnessed the scene, something lingered in the air. The man in the wheelchair sat a little straighter now, his fear replaced by a quiet confidence. Across the street, people who had paused to watch began to move again, but with glances of respect in Snoop's direction. The teenagers who had caused the trouble were long gone, but the lesson they'd learned would stick with them. It wasn't just about being confronted by a celebrity, it was about realizing how wrong they'd been, and how easy it was to make a different choice. Snoop didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew his presence had made a difference, not just for the man he'd helped, but for everyone who had seen how a moment of kindness and strength could change the course of someone's day. As Snoop turned the corner, slipping his earbuds back in, the mellow beat picked up right where it left off, but something about the vibe felt even better now. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about knowing he'd done the right thing, even when no one asked him to. Because sometimes, strength isn't in how loud you are or how hard you fight. It's in standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. And for Snoop Dogg, that was just another part of who he was, a man who showed up when it mattered most.